Now, let me tell you a story and tell me if this sounds familiar. Mark and Jenna are both working professionals. Mark is a network technician making about $79,000 a year. Jenna works as a project coordinator for a healthcare company bringing in $66,000. Together, their household income lands somewhere around $145,000. That puts them in the top 25% of American households. They should be crushing it. They should be able to save aggressively, invest for retirement, take a vacation once in a while. But instead they are stressed. Most months, their money disappears faster than they expect. The paychecks come in, the bills get paid, and suddenly there isn't much left to work with. They do have some savings, but realistically it would only cover a couple months of expenses. And life has a way of testing that. Not long ago their air conditioner broke in the middle of summer. The repair wasn't catastrophic, just a little over $1,000. Still, it was enough that they ended up putting it on a credit card instead of draining the small cushion they had. The confusing part is that they didn't do anything wrong. They went to school, built careers, got married, combined their incomes, and bought a house in a decent neighborhood. They followed the plan exactly the way they were told to. So why does it still feel like they're barely staying afloat? Why does a household earning well into six figures still feel this financially fragile? If you've ever looked at your combined income and thought, "We make too much money to feel this broke," you're not alone. And once you see what's actually happening, a lot of things start to make sense. For a long time, crossing into a six-figure household income was supposed to be the moment everything clicked into place. It meant you had finally reached the level where money stopped being a constant worry. The bills were covered, savings started growing, and life felt stable. That was the promise people like Mark and Jenna grew up hearing. But somewhere along the way, that milestone quietly lost its power. Over the past few years, the cost of everyday life has moved in a direction that salaries simply haven't kept up with. Housing payments climbed. Insurance premiums crept higher. Grocery bills started looking completely different than they did just a few years ago. None of these changes happened overnight, but together they reshaped the math of an ordinary household. So even though Mark and Jenna technically earn more than ever before, it doesn't translate into the kind of financial breathing room earlier generations expected at this income level. And they're far from the only ones noticing it. Across the country, millions of couples with two steady incomes are quietly asking the same question. How did making more money start feeling like it still isn't enough? Because the reality is, what's happening to Mark and Jenna isn't just about budgeting or bad luck. It's part of a much bigger shift that changed how modern households actually work. And once you understand that shift, the entire situation starts to look very different. What makes this situation even more puzzling is that the numbers should work in their favor. A household earning around $145,000 a year sits well above the national median income in the United States, which hovers around $75,000. In simple terms, Mark and Jenna earn nearly twice what the typical household brings in. So logically, they should feel ahead. But when you look at how the cost of living has changed over time, the equation starts to look very different. Take housing. Decades ago, the average home price was roughly 3 times the average household income. Today, in many parts of the country, it's closer to 5 or 6 times that income. Groceries have followed a similar path. Since 2020 alone, food prices in the U.S. have jumped by more than 20%. A shopping trip that once cost $100 can now easily push past $120 or even $130. None of these increases feel dramatic by themselves. A little more for food, a higher insurance bill, property taxes creeping upward year after year. But once you stack them together, something important becomes clear. The extra income households are earning today isn't creating the financial breathing room people expected. It's mostly being absorbed by the rising cost of everyday life. And that leads to an uncomfortable question. If 2 solid salaries used to be enough to get ahead, why do so many couples feel like they're just keeping up? Part of the answer lies in a shift that happened quietly over the past few decades. Back in the 1960s and 70s, most households relied on a single primary income. One person worked full-time, and that paycheck was expected to cover the essentials: housing, food, transportation, and raising a family. And surprisingly for many families, it actually did. In 1970, nearly half of married households in the United States had only one primary earner. Today, that number has flipped. Around 2/3 of married couples now rely on 2 incomes just to maintain a similar standard of living. At first glance, that sounds like a massive advantage. 2 paychecks instead of 1 should mean more money, more security, and more flexibility. But the economy didn't stay frozen in time while that change happened. As dual-income households became the norm, something subtle began to occur. The cost of major life expenses started adjusting to the assumption that two adults were working. Housing markets responded to larger household budgets. Childcare became a necessary expense instead of a rare one. School districts, neighborhoods, and entire communities began pricing themselves around families with two earners. In other words, the financial boost that two incomes once provided slowly became the baseline. So instead of two salaries creating extra breathing room, for many families they simply became the minimum requirement to stay in the middle class. And once that shift took hold, it changed the entire financial landscape for couples like Mark and Jenna. And nowhere does that shift show up more clearly than in housing. For most families, housing is the single largest expense they'll ever have, and over the past few decades it has grown much faster than incomes. In the early 1980s, the median home price in the United States was a little under $50,000. Today, the median price is well over $400,000. Even after adjusting for inflation, housing has taken a much larger bite out of the average household budget. You can see the impact in a simple rule economists often reference. For a long time, a healthy housing payment was supposed to stay under about 30% of a household's income. That used to be manageable for many families. Today, millions of households are spending far more than that just to keep a roof over their heads. For couples like Mark and Jenna, this changes everything. Housing isn't just another bill anymore. It becomes the anchor that determines how the rest of the budget works. When a large portion of your income goes straight into housing, the margin for everything else gets smaller. Saving takes longer. Unexpected expenses hit harder. Financial security starts to feel fragile. And that's before you even factor in the other costs that didn't weigh nearly as heavily on families a generation ago. Another pressure point that didn't exist in quite the same way decades ago is childcare. For many modern households, having two incomes also means paying for someone else to watch the kids while both parents are at work. And that cost has climbed dramatically. In a lot of states, the average price of full-time childcare now sits somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 per year for a single child. In some major cities, it can climb well past $20,000. Put that on screen for a second. That's the equivalent of a small mortgage payment just for daycare. For Mark and Jenna, this creates a strange financial loop. The second income helps pay for the household, but part of that income immediately disappears into childcare so both of them can keep working. And when you start stacking these major costs together, housing, childcare, healthcare, insurance, you begin to see why so many dual-income families still feel stretched. Because the second paycheck doesn't always create extra breathing room. In many cases, it simply helps cover the growing list of expenses that didn't weigh nearly as heavily on families in the past. And that list keeps getting longer. And then there are the costs that don't look huge on their own, but quietly pile up over time. Health insurance is a good example. Over the past 2 decades, the average cost of family health coverage in the United States has more than tripled. Even when employers cover part of it, many households still pay several $100s every month in premiums alone. Then there's everything else that attaches itself to modern life. Internet bills, phone plans, car insurance, streaming services, software subscriptions, small monthly charges that didn't really exist a generation ago. Individually, most of these expenses don't seem like a big deal. $10 here, $30 there, maybe $100 for something essential. But when you zoom out, the numbers start stacking up quickly. A few $100s a month becomes a few thousand a year, and suddenly a big chunk of a household's income is already spoken for before they've even started thinking about saving or investing. For Mark and Jenna, it creates a constant sense that the financial treadmill never slows down. They're earning solid salaries, they're working full-time, but more and more of that income is already committed the moment it arrives. And the result is a strange modern reality. 2 incomes used to represent financial freedom. Now, for many households, they simply represent the cost of staying in the game. So when Mark and Jenna sit at the kitchen table looking over their finances, the feeling that something doesn't quite add up isn't coming from nowhere. They're earning good money. In fact, by most statistical measures, they're doing better than the majority of households. And yet the sense of security that income used to bring just isn't there. Because the rules around money changed. Housing expanded to match larger household budgets. Childcare became a built-in cost for families with 2 working parents. Healthcare, insurance, and everyday services slowly absorbed more and more of what used to be disposable income. None of these changes happened all at once. They crept in over years, sometimes decades. but together they reshaped what it means to live a comfortable life. That's why so many couples look at their combined income and still feel uneasy. Not because they're irresponsible, not because they made some massive mistake, but because the financial system they stepped into quietly evolved around 2 paychecks instead of 1. And for households like Mark and Jenna, that means something that once represented opportunity now feels more like a requirement. 2 salaries were supposed to get families ahead. For a growing number of people today, they simply make staying afloat possible.